The bid came in at 1147. By 1149, Zion Beaumont had found 3 structural flaws in it. By 1151, his uncle Prescott was straightening Zion's tie and whispering, "Don't talk about numbers tonight. Just smile." That was the Beaumont family's version of preparation.
I'm not going to pretend I didn't know what this night was. I've sat through enough family strategy meetings to understand the language they use when they stop talking about business and start talking about me. They call it positioning. What they mean is, we have a liability, and we need someone powerful enough to absorb it. The liability is me, Zion Beaumont, Omega, diagnosed infertile at 23. The only person in this family who can run a discounted cash flow model in his head. And somehow the only one nobody wants in the room. I've done the math on tonight, too. Our shipping contracts are down 14%. 2 allied syndicates already backed out of renewal talks. And the solution everyone landed on was, put Zion in a tuxedo, walk him into a Manhattan gala full of people who decide who lives and who doesn't in this business, and see if someone bites. Not because I bring value, because I'm attached to a name that still carries weight. And because no one wants to say out loud what they actually think of me.
The Caldwell Grand was the kind of venue that made money feel ancient. Chandeliers the size of small aircraft. Men in $3,000 suits moving through the space like they owned the air. Zion walked in between Prescott and his cousin Darren, which was exactly how a man gets walked when the people next to him care more about who sees them than where they're going. Hi viewers, I want to ask you something personal. If your own family decided your biggest value was looking good enough to stand next to someone powerful, would you go along with it, or would you walk out? Drop your honest answer in the comments right now. I really want to know. Prescott scanned the ballroom like a man inventory checking a room that owed him something. His hand rested on Zion's shoulder the way a hand rests on a door handle. Positioned, not affectionate. Rashida Harmon is here. Callaway Syndicate. Controls 3 port agreements on the eastern seaboard. 20 minutes. Be charming. Be appropriate. Zion was barely listening. Because on the east side of the room, the crowd had arranged itself differently. Not clustering toward power the way people usually did, but parting from it. 3 men stood near the far wall, and every person within 15 feet of them was performing twice as hard as everyone else. The specific social physics of people in the presence of someone who stopped needing to prove anything a long time ago. The Serrano Triplets, Kaz, Dre, and Malachi. Zion had read their financials the way other people read biographies, start to finish twice with notes. Their syndicate didn't lose. In 22 years, they had absorbed 4 hostile takeover attempts, outlasted 2 federal investigations, and restructured their entire logistics network without a single public announcement. They were not rumor, they were result, and they were not known for mercy. Zion understood, standing in that ballroom in his uncle's shadow, that this gala was not matchmaking. It was positioning. His family needed a powerful ally to absorb their heat, and they needed that ally to have a reason to stay close. Zion was meant to be that reason. Not his mind, not his work. Just his name, his status, and the hope that someone would see a quiet young man in a good suit and decide he was worth keeping. He was still running the numbers on Harmon's port agreements, which were, by his estimate, running on a routing model at least 8 months out of date, when Prescott went rigid beside him. 'Cause Serrano was looking at him, not scanning and happening to land. Directly, deliberately, with the specific quality of attention someone gives to a thing they have already decided is worth their time. Behind Kez, Malachi said something low to Dre. Then Dre's eyes moved to Zion. Then Malachi's. All 3 of them, looking. Prescott's voice came fast and tight near his ear. Smile. They're looking at you. Zion didn't smile. He held Kez Serrano's gaze for 4 deliberate seconds. Long enough to be intentional, short enough not to be a challenge, and then looked away first. But his pulse had changed, and he noticed that too. Nobody laughed around the Serrano Triplets. That was the first thing Zion noticed when he got close enough to observe them. Not the money, not the way their suits fit like a second skin, not even the deference radiating off everyone near them. It was the absence of laughter from the 3 of them that made the room feel different. Everyone else was performing. These three were watching, and somehow that was louder than everything else combined.
The thing about real power is that it doesn't perform. I learned that from studying their financials before I ever saw their faces. The Serranos never announced a move before they made it. They didn't need applause. Everyone else in that ballroom was laughing too hard, gesturing too wide, filling up space with personality like it was currency they were running out of. These three just watched, and I couldn't stop watching them watch. I told myself I was here for the Harmon introduction. I told myself I was going to smile, not say anything useful, let my family use my presence like a bargaining chip, and get out. I was not here for the Serranos. I was definitely not going to spend 20 minutes calculating the deadweight loss in their eastern shipping corridor just because I'd read their last 4 annual reports and I could already see from across a ballroom that their rerouting strategy was off.
He spent the next 20 minutes calculating the dead weight loss in their eastern shipping corridor. The Harmon introduction happened on schedule. Rashida Harmon assessed Zion in under 10 seconds with the specific boredom of someone who had already categorized him before he opened his mouth. It was honestly fair. Prescott moved through the introduction with practiced authority. Zion said the right things at the right moments and felt like a prop that had been taught to speak. He was mid-sentence when a voice cut through the ambient noise of the room from 3 feet behind him. The Veracruz reroute. Zion stopped, turned. Because Serrano was not looking at Prescott, not at Rashida Harmon. He was looking at Zion with the flat, focused attention of a man asking a question he actually needed answered. We moved 62% of our southern volume through Veracruz after the Panama delays, Kiss said. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. Transit times are up 11 days on the Atlantic leg. 2 actuaries and a logistics firm told us the reroute is optimal. I want to know what you think. The nearby conversations went quieter in the way a room does when something unexpected has arrived. Prescott laughed with the anxiety of a man who could not tell what was happening. I think you may have us confused with. I'm asking him, Kaz said. Zion looked at Kaz for 1 full second. Then did the thing he'd been trained his entire adult life not to do in a social setting. He answered honestly. The reroute is costing you more than the actuaries are showing. Veracruz has fuel surcharge structures that shift on a 60-day cycle. Whoever ran your optimization model didn't account for the Q3 adjustment. You're absorbing a 9 to 11% efficiency loss on every Atlantic leg that touches that corridor. Your original Gulf routing was closer to optimal. You moved too fast after the Panama delays. The nearby conversations had stopped pretending entirely. Dre Serrano tilted his head. Malikai went still in the way that focused people go still when they're processing something unexpected. Kaz looked at Zion the way someone looks at a number that changes their entire calculation. Then, quietly, interesting. Zion felt something strange settle in his chest. Not warmth exactly, something older than that. The Serranos weren't performing delight. They weren't filing him under charming and forgetting him by Tuesday. They were remembering him. That night, a private envelope arrived from the Serrano group. No letterhead, no explanation, just an address in Midtown and a time. The envelope had 1 line of text printed in clean, 12-point font, consultancy, temporary, confidential, your terms. Zion read it 4 times, then made coffee and read it again. It was not a command. He had received commands before. From his father, from Prescott, from every room his family had ever walked him into. Commands pressed down from the front, heavy and directional. This was different. This had the texture of a choice, which meant his uncle's call, when it came, landed harder. You will not accept anything from the Serranos. Prescott's voice had the cold, compressed quality it got when he was performing control. Whatever they offered, it's a trap. They're testing you to test us. If you go near them without family authorization, you will embarrass this family in front of every allied syndicate on the eastern seaboard, and I will not spend $1 of Beaumont capital cleaning it up. Do you understand me? Yes, Zion said. He said yes because he had learned, young and permanently, that the fastest way to end a conversation with Prescott Beaumont was to agree with him. Thursday morning, at 8:56, Zion walked into the Serrano Group's Midtown headquarters. The building was not what he expected. Not glass and spectacle, the architecture that announces wealth because it's still insecure about it. It was older, quieter, stone and wood, and the specific absence of decoration that says we stopped proving things a long time ago. Everything in the building had the quality of a space where people came to think, not to perform. Kaz, Dre, and Malachi were waiting in a conference room with a view of the Hudson. No aides, no audience. Just the three of them and a table covered in logistics routing data, actual working documents, not presentation materials. Malachi slid a folder across the table without preamble. Atlantic leg. Full corridor data. Tell us what you see. Zion sat down, opened the folder, and went to work. He didn't perform gratitude. He didn't circle the subject. He read, and when he spoke to the data. For 90 minutes, nobody in that room talked about anything except numbers. Zion fixed 2 routing inefficiencies, identified a pattern in their fuel surcharge exposure that their actuaries had been smoothing over for 2 quarters, and outlined a restructuring approach that would recover approximately 8% of their projected annual loss without touching their current carrier relationships. The triplets took notes. Nobody asked about his Omega status. Nobody asked about his family. Nobody managed him. He was almost at the door when Dre said, still looking at his notes, "We know about the fertility diagnosis." Zion stopped. His hand was on the door handle. He gave himself exactly the time he needed to make sure his voice, when he used it, would be level. Then he turned. Dre looked at him with the same flat, direct attention all 3 of them used. No pity, no performance of graciousness, no the specific theater people produced when they were about to say something they thought was kind but was actually condescending. Just information, offered plainly. "We've known since Tuesday," Dre said. "It doesn't affect the offer." Zion looked at all 3 of them. Kaz, leaning back in his chair. Dre with his pen still in his hand. Malachi watching him with the quiet patience of someone who had already run this conversation in his head and wasn't surprised by how it was going. Then Kaz said, with the same tone he used for logistics data, "We're not interested in heirs. We're interested in survival." The Hudson was flat and silver outside the window. Zion stood in the doorway of a conference room belonging to the most powerful syndicate in the Northeastern Corridor, and listened to 3 men tell him that the thing his entire family had used to define and diminish him was, to them, simply irrelevant. He didn't know what to do with that. It sat in his chest like something that had been waiting to be put down. He took the offer. Being listened to, actually listened to, where someone takes what you said and does something real with it, turned out to be the most disorienting experience of Zion Beaumont's professional life. He'd expected skepticism, testing, the quiet condescension that powerful people sometimes dressed up as patience. He had not expected to sit in a meeting on his 3rd day and watch Malachi Serrano implement his suggestion in real time while Zion was still explaining the reasoning behind it. It was destabilizing in the way that only good things can be destabilizing. By the end of week 2, Zion had submitted 4 analysis reports. All 4 had been acted on, not considered, not taken under advisement. That political softness used by people who intend to bury something. Dre restructured their insurance exposure model based on Zion's variance analysis. Kaz initiated a review of their Gulf carrier relationships on Zion's recommendation. Malachi, without announcement, began forwarding Zion's logistics briefs directly to their senior partners. He had written in a notes app on his phone, 3 years ago after a Beaumont family strategy session, what hurt most wasn't the insult, it was the silence. He'd laid out a complete risk mitigation plan for their shipping contracts. Watched his father turn immediately to Prescott afterward and ask what Prescott thought. He hadn't deleted that note. He looked at it sometimes. Inside the Serrano group now, surrounded by people who asked for his projections and then used them, he understood the full weight of what he'd meant. This was the opposite of silence. And it scared him, which told him something important about how long he'd been living without it. The Beaumont family noticed the shift in week 3. Not because Zion had told them anything, because the market had. 3 allied syndicates that had been pulling back from Beaumont contract renewals had, within 10 days of Zion's restructuring recommendations going live, redirected their attention elsewhere. None of it pointed directly at Zion. But Prescott was not a man who missed patterns. Gideon Beaumont called on a Tuesday. Zion's father, not Prescott, which meant the temperature had risen. "You've been moving against us," Gideon said. His voice had the quality of a man who had practiced this sentence before dialing. "I've been doing my job," Zion said. "Your job is to this family. Then this family should have given me one." 5 seconds of silence. In 26 years, Zion had never said anything like that to his father. The words had been sitting in him so long that he hadn't known they were ready to come out until they already had. Gideon hung up. Zion sat with the dead phone in his hand and tried to feel relieved, and mostly just felt like something had been cut. Not broken. Cut. There was a difference. It hurt either way. He was back at his desk within the hour. He had work to do. On Thursday, Kaz dropped a document on Zion's desk at 6:15 in the evening without knocking, which was apparently how Kaz communicated urgency. No door knock, just the document. It was a summary of an investigative filing from the Creston Group, a rival syndicate. They were claiming that proprietary routing data from the Serrano Group's Atlantic operations had been leaked to a third-party logistics firm now using it to undercut Serrano contracts in 3 primary markets. The data was specific enough that it could only have come from someone with direct internal access to their projections. Kaz watched him read it. Zion looked up. "How many people had access to these projections?" "Before you joined us," Kaz said evenly, 7. After 8. The implication didn't need elaboration. And whoever had done this had known exactly how it would land. The timing was deliberate. The scope of the leak was deliberate. Someone had waited until Zion Beaumont had access to the Serrano network, and then made their move. He would know who by morning. Zion worked through the night. Not because anyone asked him to, Kaz had, in fact, told him to go home, which was remarkable given the circumstances, but because there was a data trail inside the Serrano Group system architecture that would tell him exactly what had happened, and he was not built for sleeping next to an unsolved problem. By 4 in the morning, he had it. The breach had not come through Zion's access point. The routing data leaked to the Creston Group's third-party firm had been pulled from a legacy data node that predated Zion's credentials. A partition from the Serrano Group's old network infrastructure that hadn't been decommissioned after their last upgrade. Whoever had done this had known the legacy node existed. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was someone who had been inside the Serrano world long enough to know where the old doors were. He presented his findings at 7 a.m. clean and linear. Timestamps, IP routing data, the full sequence of access events showing the breach had originated externally 3 weeks before Zion ever set foot in the building. Dre asked 2 questions. Molly Kai confirmed the timestamps. Kaz said nothing for a full minute. Then, cleared. 1 word. No ceremony. Zion let himself feel safe. For the first time in a very long time, the ground felt solid underneath him. He let himself feel that for approximately 4 hours. The second data pull, the one he ran because he was constitutionally incapable of leaving a clean answer alone when loose threads remained, came back at 2:17 in the afternoon. He sat with it for a while. The external access point traced back through 2 intermediate servers to a private network registered in Delaware. Standard shell routing. But the Delaware network's management contact on file was a legal firm Zion recognized. Not because it was famous, but because Prescott Beaumont had used them for contract filings since Zion was 19 years old. He checked it again. Then a 3rd time. He cross-referenced the IP routing against the timestamp of a Beaumont family strategy meeting he had not been invited to 3 weeks ago, the week before his consultancy began, and found that the legacy Serrano node had been accessed within a 6-hour window of that meeting. Zion sat very still at his desk and looked at the data on his screen. His uncle Prescott hadn't been trying to sabotage the Serranos. He'd been trying to manufacture a reason for the Serranos to cut Zion loose, so Zion would have no choice but to come home, to return to the role he'd always been assigned. Quiet, managed, positioned. useful only when pointed in the right direction by the right hands. The Beaumont family hadn't lost Zion to the Serranos. They'd tried to take him back. Dre appeared in the doorway at 3:10. "You found something else." Not a question. Zion turned his chair around, looked at Dre, then at the screen, then back at Dre. "Yes." Dre walked in, closed the door, and read the data trail Zion had assembled. When he finished, he looked at Zion with the particular attention the Serranos used when they were about to ask something that actually mattered. "What do you want done about it?" 6 words. No assumption. No suggestion that the Serranos had already decided how this should end and were just informing him. Just the question, given to him like it was actually his to answer. Zion thought about his father hanging up the phone. Prescott's hand on his shoulder at the Caldwell Grand, positioning him, pointing him at rooms the way you point a weapon. Every strategy session where his analysis had been heard and quietly set aside. He looked at the data on his screen. His uncle's fingerprints. Precise and undeniable. Then he said the one thing Dre Serrano had not expected. "Nothing." What did you think Zion was going to do? Burn his uncle down or let it go entirely? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story hit different, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Chapter 6 is where the mercy gets expensive. A story of power, belonging, and the cost of being underestimated. Dre Serrano had a specific way of waiting for an answer. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't look at anything else in the room. He didn't drum his fingers or check his watch or do any of the small physical things that people did when they were pretending patience they didn't actually have. He just went very, very still, like a man who had decided that the next sentence out of the other person's mouth was the most important piece of data he was going to receive all week, and he was going to receive it correctly. Zion had said nothing, and Dre was waiting for him to explain what nothing meant, because nothing from where Dre was standing was not a small answer. Nothing in the syndicate world, where information was the same currency as blood and betrayal was typically answered in kind, was a statement that required unpacking. Zion set his hands flat on his desk. He looked at the data trail on his screen one more time, the Delaware network, the timestamps, the access logs that spelled out his Uncle Prescott's involvement with the cold clarity of an audit report, and then he looked at Dre. "I don't want the Serranos to move against my uncle," he said. "I don't want a counterfiling. I don't want it escalated to the council. I don't want Prescott Beaumont made an example of. What I want is to fix the system that made this possible in the first place." Dre tilted his head by a fraction of an inch. It was the Serrano equivalent of a raised eyebrow. Meaning the reason my uncle thought this move was worth making, Zion said, is because he believes I'm a liability that needs to be retrieved. And he believes that because the entire syndicate network, not just the Beaumonts but every allied family on the eastern seaboard, still operates on a framework that treats omega status and fertility as the primary metrics for value and succession. He wasn't wrong about how the system works. He was wrong about me, and those are 2 different problems. He paused. "I want to fix the second one, and the first one handles itself." Dre looked at him for a long moment. Then he straightened up, walked to the door, opened it and said, without turning around, "You need to tell them that yourself." Zion assumed he meant Kaz and Malachi. He was right. He was also not entirely prepared for the fact that telling Kaz and Malachi meant telling them in the conference room on the 14th floor at 7:30 the next morning, with a full summary of his proposal laid out in document form on the table in front of all 3 of them. He had written it the night before. It had taken him 4 hours. Not because the argument was difficult. He'd been building it in the back of his mind for 3 years, every time a strategy session had dismissed him, every time his family had introduced him as an asset rather than a person, but because he wanted it to be exact. He wasn't writing a grievance. He was writing a restructuring proposal. The document was titled Succession Charter Reform Across Allied Syndicate Networks, a Risk-Based Framework for Diversified Leadership. 14 pages, data heavy. Built on 22 years of syndicate performance records, cross-referenced with succession outcomes and contract survival rates. The core argument was simple and it was devastating. Syndicates that concentrated succession authority in fertility-based bloodline hierarchies collapsed, on average, 40% faster than those that distributed leadership across demonstrated competence. The data did not leave room for argument. The data had never left room for argument. Nobody had just put it in a document and handed it to the right people before. Kaz read the whole thing without speaking. Malachi read it twice. Dre, who had already read a preliminary version the night before when Zion had walked him through the concept, sat with his coffee and watched his brothers read. "You're proposing this goes to every allied family," Kaz said finally. "It wasn't a question." "I'm proposing it goes to the council," Zion said. "The allied families follow the council. If the Serrano group backs this reform at the council level, adoption becomes a question of when, not if." Malachi set down his copy of the document. He had the quality, in moments like this, of a man running a calculation that had nothing to do with math. "You understand what this costs us politically if we back it and it fails. I understand what it costs you politically if you back it and it succeeds," Zion said. "You become the syndicate that redesigned the framework. That's not a liability. That's 2 generations of goodwill with every Omega family in the network." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Kaz looked at Malachi. Malachi looked at Dre. The 3 of them did the thing they did, the wordless, precise communication of people who had spent their entire lives inside each other's orbit, and then Kaz nodded once. "We back it," he said. "Formally. In writing, before the council meeting." Zion felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. He had expected negotiation. He had prepared for pushback, for conditions, for the specific friction of powerful people being asked to spend capital on someone else's reform. He had not expected agreement delivered in under 4 minutes. "Thank you," he said. Kaz looked at him with the expression of a man who found gratitude slightly puzzling. "You built the argument. We're just standing behind it." The political backlash started within 48 hours. The Hargrove Syndicate, a mid-Atlantic family with deep ties to 3 of the council's senior members, filed a formal objection to the proposed charter review before the agenda had even been published. The Whitfield Group issued a statement calling the reform destabilizing to established succession protocols. 2 smaller allied families quietly withdrew from a joint contract discussion that the Serranos had been building toward for 6 months. Zion tracked it all from the 14th floor and felt the specific, familiar weight of a system that did not want to change, pushing back against the pressure of being asked to. He had felt versions of this his entire life, just never at this scale, and never from the outside of it. On the 4th day, Gideon Beaumont called. Not Prescott. Zion's father again, which meant the pressure had moved up another level. "You've gone too far," Gideon said. His voice was quieter than it had been during the last call. Quieter, Zion had learned over 26 years, was not calmer. Quieter was what happened when his father had moved past being angry into being resolved. This reform proposal, the Serranos backing it. You've made yourself a political object, Zion, and you have no idea what that means in a council environment. You are not equipped for what's coming. "I built the data model," Zion said. "I understand exactly what's coming." "You understand numbers," his father said. "You do not understand people." It was the kind of sentence that was designed to land like a blade, and it did, for exactly the 3 seconds it took Zion to remember every room he had ever walked out of with more information than the person who tried to dismiss him. Then it stopped. "I understand enough," he said. And he hung up first. For the second time in a week, he hung up on his father. And it felt each time a little more like standing up and a little less like falling. The Emergency Council Summit was called on a Thursday, 7 days out. The agenda was officially listed as Review of Proposed Charter Amendments to Allied Succession Protocols. Unofficially, every person in the syndicate network knew exactly what it was. A vote on whether Zion Beaumont's document lived or died, and whether the Serrano group had overreached by backing it. Zion was reviewing the attendance list, 41 council members, representing 19 allied families, when Dre walked into his office and set a printed news brief on his desk. It was a statement, issued publicly that morning from Prescott Beaumont, formally submitted to the council as a registered objection. Zion read it. His uncle had not argued against the data. He had not challenged the performance analysis or the succession metrics or the 22 years of cross-referenced outcomes. Prescott Beaumont was smarter than that. What he had done was simpler and older, and in the context of a syndicate council chamber, potentially more powerful than any data set in the world. At the bottom of the formal objection, in language that was technically procedural and therefore undeniable, Prescott Beaumont had submitted the following for council consideration. The primary author of the proposed charter reform is an Omega individual who has been medically confirmed as infertile, and therefore lacks standing under current council bylaws to advance succession-related proposals without a sponsoring alpha of record. He wasn't arguing the reform was wrong. He was arguing that Zion didn't have the right to propose it. The council summit was 7 days away. And Prescott Beaumont had just announced publicly, to every allied family on the eastern seaboard, that his nephew was infertile. Zion set down the paper. The room was very quiet. Dre was watching him. He announced publicly, he's infertile. He cannot represent us. Zion said it out loud. Not to Dre, not to anyone in the room. Just to hear what it sounded like when it was no longer a family secret and had become, instead, a political weapon fired in front of 41 council members and 19 allied families. It sounded like the opening of a war. The room froze around him. Dre hadn't moved. And somewhere in the Serrano Group's network of relationships and allies and carefully maintained intelligence channels, Zion understood the clock had just started. The Meridian Council Chamber was a room built to make people feel small. That was not an accident. It was architecture deployed as a statement of institutional permanence. The ceilings were 30 feet high. The gallery seating curved in a three-quarter circle around the central floor like an old Roman amphitheater, and every seat in that gallery was occupied. 41 council members, representatives from 19 allied families, 3 legal observers, 1 court stenographer. And in the third row of the gallery, sitting alone with his hands folded in his lap and his face carrying the specific, composed expression of a man who had already won a fight, he hadn't yet had to throw a punch in, Prescott Beaumont. Zion walked into that room alone. Not because the Serranos had abandoned him. They were here, seated in the council member section with the formal, declared backing they had committed to in writing 6 days ago. But the procedural rules of the council were clear. The presenter of a proposed charter reform stood on the central floor without representation. You made your argument yourself or you didn't make it at all. Zion had read the bylaws 4 times. He understood the rule. He had, in fact, been counting on it. He set his materials on the presentation surface, a tablet, a data projector remote, and 14 printed copies of his reform document, and he stood up straight. The chamber was loud with the ambient noise of 40-odd people settling into their seats and making the small adjustments that rooms made before something important began. Zion let the noise wash over him and breathed out slowly through his nose and did the thing he had trained himself to do in every high-stakes meeting he had ever walked into. He found the numbers. Not the people. The numbers. The data was real. The data did not have political relationships or family allegiances or personal grievances. The data was what it was, and it said what it said, and when you were standing on a marble floor in front of 41 people who had been sent here partly to bury you, the data was the only friend in the room that couldn't be pressured. The chamber president, a large, silver-haired man named Cornelius Ashby, called the session to order and read the procedural objection from the Beaumont family into the official record. He read it without inflection, which was the council's way of treating it as legitimate without endorsing it. When he finished, he looked at Zion. The presenter may respond to the procedural challenge before advancing to substantive argument. Zion nodded. He walked to the center of the floor, turned to face the gallery, and let the room go quiet on its own. He did not rush it. He had learned, in the past several weeks, that the people who controlled the pace of a room were not always the ones who spoke first. Sometimes they were the ones who were comfortable enough to wait. The procedural objection filed by the Beaumont family representative, Zion said, argues that I lack standing to advance this proposal because I am an Omega individual confirmed as infertile, and therefore do not meet the qualifications for succession-adjacent advocacy under current council bylaws. He paused. I want to be very precise about what that objection actually is, because I think it's important that this chamber understands it clearly before we proceed. He turned slightly, moving his gaze across the curved gallery in a slow, deliberate arc. He was not performing anger. He was not performing hurt. He was performing something far more controlled and far more dangerous in a room full of people who respected competence above almost everything else. Precision. That objection is not an argument about the validity of the data in my reform proposal. It is not a challenge to the succession performance metrics, the survival rate analysis, or the 22 years of cross-referenced outcomes that form the evidentiary foundation of this document. He held up the document briefly. The objection is a procedural move designed to remove the messenger without engaging the message. And I want the council to understand something about what that means. He clicked the projector remote. The first slide appeared on the screen behind him. A clean, unadorned graph showing syndicate survival rates over a 20-year period, segmented by succession model. The fertility-based bloodline succession model sat at the bottom of the curve. Demonstrably, by a margin that was not close. Syndicates that have concentrated succession authority in fertility-based hierarchies have collapsed, on average, 40% faster than those that distribute leadership across demonstrated competence, he said. That is not my opinion. That is the performance record of every allied family in this network, compiled from council-registered financial disclosures over the past 2 decades. The data is in the document in front of you. Every number is sourced and verifiable. I am not asking this chamber to take my word for anything. I am asking you to read your own history. The room had gone the specific kind of quiet that happened when a large group of people were all deciding simultaneously whether to be offended or convinced. Zion moved to the next slide. I will now address the procedural objection directly, he said. Under current Council Bylaw 14, Section 3, succession-related proposals require either a sponsoring alpha of record or a demonstrated material stake in the outcome of the proposed change. I am an Omega individual, and the Beaumont family has made my fertility status a matter of public record in this chamber today. He let that sit for exactly 1 beat. My material stake in the outcome of succession protocol reform is therefore not in question. It is, in fact, the most comprehensively documented material stake in this chamber. I am the subject of the exact policy this reform is designed to address. Under Section 3, that constitutes standing. The procedural objection fails on its own terms. Cornelius Ashby looked at the legal observers. One of them nodded. Ashby wrote something down. Zion moved to the next slide. He was not done. But I want to address something else, he said. Not procedurally, substantively. The Beaumont family representative made my fertility diagnosis a public fact in this chamber. I want to be clear about why he did that. It was not a legal argument. It was a social one. It was an attempt to make this room look at me and see a deficiency, so that the data I'm presenting would be filtered through that lens before you ever engaged with it. He paused. I have spent my entire professional life being looked at through that lens. I know exactly what it feels like. And I want to tell this chamber something important. The gallery was silent. 41 council members. 19 allied families. Prescott Beaumont in the 3rd row with his hands still folded. It does not change a single number on that screen. He clicked to the next slide. And the next. He moved through the entire dataset. Succession outcomes, contract survival rates, leadership concentration risk, the compound vulnerability of bloodline-dependent power structures, the historical average time to collapse for syndicates that had prioritized fertility over function. He moved through it methodically and clearly and without a single word of anger, because anger was what they were waiting for, and he was not going to give them the comfort of it. He was presenting a financial case. He was presenting a risk analysis. He was presenting the documented, sourced, verifiable argument that the framework this entire network had been operating under was costing every family in the room money and stability and longevity, and that the personal information Prescott Beaumont had just made public about his nephew was, in the context of that argument, evidence rather than ammunition. He did not look at his uncle once during the presentation. Not because he was afraid of what he would see, but because Prescott Beaumont was not the audience. He had never been the audience. The 41 council members were the audience, and Zion kept his eyes on the people he needed to reach and did not spend a single second of the next hour looking anywhere else. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then Cornelius Ashby said, "The presenter references a Serrano Group Charter Amendment as an active example of the proposed reform framework. Can the Serrano Group confirm this amendment is current and in effect?" Every head in the gallery turned to the council member section. Zion turned too. He looked at Kaz. Kaz looked back at him with the flat, clear attention that Zion had come to understand was the Serrano version of steadiness. Not warmth exactly, but something more durable than warmth. Something that held. Then Kaz Serrano stood up. Slowly and without performance. Dre stood a half-second later. Malachi a half-second after that. All three of them on their feet together in the council chamber, in front of every allied family on the eastern seaboard. "Confirmed," Kaz said. "The Serrano Group amended its succession charter 14 days ago. The amendment is registered, in effect, and available for council review. We stand behind the reform proposal in full." The silence that followed was not the silence of a room that was undecided. It was the silence of a room in the process of recalculating. Zion stood on the marble floor of the Meridian Council chamber and felt the air in the room shift the way air shifts when a system reaches a tipping point. Not loud, not dramatic, just the very quiet, irreversible movement of weight from one side to the other. The council demanded a confirmation vote on the procedural objection. 7 minutes later, it failed. 26 to 15. The substantive reform proposal went to formal deliberation. But Zion already knew. The deliberation was procedural. The room had already decided. He looked at the third row of the gallery. Prescott Beaumont was still in his seat. Hands still folded, face still composed. But the composition had a different quality now. Not the composed expression of a man who had already won. The composed expression of a man working very hard not to show that he had lost. The formal deliberation lasted 2 days. Zion did not attend most of it, which surprised the people who had expected him to sit in the gallery and watch every hour of it like a man monitoring his own verdict. He didn't. He went back to the 14th floor and he worked on the implementation framework because the deliberation was going to end the way it was going to end, and what mattered after it ended was whether the machinery to execute the reform was already built and ready to run. He had learned that from the Serranos, actually, not from anything they told him directly. They weren't the kind of people who delivered lessons. He'd learned it from watching how they operated. They never waited for confirmation before preparing for the confirmed outcome. They moved like the decision was already made and they built toward it, and when reality caught up to what they'd already prepared for, they were ready in a way that looked, from the outside, like effortless competence. It wasn't effortless. It was relentless preparation disguised as calm. The reform passed on a Wednesday afternoon. The final vote was 29 to 12. Cornelius Ashby called Zion at 4:17 p.m. to inform him. He used the word congratulations, which Zion suspected Ashby did not use often. Zion thanked him and stayed on the line long enough to be professional and then set his phone face down on his desk and stared at the Hudson for a full minute without moving. He had built a thing. It had held. That was not a small fact, and he was not going to let it be a small fact just because the room around him was quiet and there was no one present to perform relief for. Zion said, "Thank you," hung up, and sat with the fact of it for approximately 90 seconds. Then he opened the implementation framework and started reviewing the rollout timeline. The shift in the room happened over the next 72 hours, and it happened not with announcements or ceremonies, but with the quiet, undeniable reordering of attention that occurred when power recognized a new calculation. Investors reached out, not through intermediaries directly. 3 separate partners from allied syndicate families who had said nothing during the council deliberation contacted Zion's work line within 48 hours of the vote, requesting meetings. Not to discuss the reform, to discuss their own succession structures and what Zion's analysis framework might look like applied to their specific networks. They were not asking for charity. They were asking for consulting services. From him, by name. Alliances shifted in subtler ways too. 2 of the families that had filed preliminary objections to the reform, the Hargrove Syndicate and one of the smaller Eastern families, quietly withdrew their objections from the council record and issued statements of measured support for the deliberative process. In syndicate language, that was as close to an apology as anyone was going to get. Rashida Harmon, the woman from the Caldwell Grand Gala whom Zion had been introduced to as a potential social connection, while his family hoped someone powerful would claim him. Rashida Harmon sent a handwritten note. It said, "Your data model on succession risk is the best piece of syndicate analysis I have read in 15 years. When you're ready to discuss a formal advisory relationship, I hope you'll call me." She had signed it with her direct line. Zion held that note for a long time. He thought about the version of himself that had stood in that ballroom 3 weeks ago, between his uncle and his cousin, being walked into a room full of powerful people and positioned as a liability to be absorbed. He thought about Prescott's hand on his shoulder. He thought about the exact, specific quality of being managed in public by the people who were supposed to protect you. Then he set the note on his desk, made a note of the callback date in his calendar, and kept working. Prescott Beaumont tried to speak at the post-vote reception. Not publicly, he wasn't making that mistake again. But in the hallway outside the council chamber, where a cluster of allied family representatives had gathered for the particular kind of socializing that happened after major decisions, when everyone was repositioning themselves relative to the new landscape. Prescott moved through the cluster with his silver watch and his practiced authority and the specific energy of a man who believed that if he kept moving confidently enough, the room would adjust itself around him. Didn't. The conversations that had been happening, the ones Prescott stepped toward, the clusters he approached, didn't stop exactly, but they thinned. People finished their sentences and found reasons to be somewhere else. Nobody was openly rude. Nobody made a scene. But in a world where access and attention were currency, being gently and consistently redirected out of every conversation you tried to enter was its own very clear statement. Prescott Beaumont moved through the post-vote reception, and the room quietly declined to have him. Zion watched it from across the hallway, not with satisfaction or not only with satisfaction, with the specific, complicated weight of watching someone who had shaped the first 26 years of your life discover that the shape he had given you no longer fit the room he needed you to fit. He thought about something he had written in that notes app on his phone years ago. He thought about it now, standing in that hallway, and he understood it differently than he had when he wrote it. What hurt most wasn't the insult. It was the silence. He had meant the silence of not being heard, of being spoken over, of having his analysis acknowledged with a nod and then immediately disregarded. But silence had another form, and he was watching it now. The silence of a room that had simply stopped responding. Not cruel. Not dramatic. Just absent. Sometimes the worst injustice wasn't loud. It was just normal. And now normal had changed. And the person who had benefited most from the old normal was standing in a hallway learning, with no dramatic announcement and no final reckoning, that the world had recalculated without him. As Serrano appeared beside Zion at the edge of the hallway, he did not announce his presence. He just materialized there in the way he did and stood looking at the same thing Zion was looking at. They stood together in silence for a moment. Then Kaz said, without looking away from the hallway, "He could contest the vote on procedural grounds. He has 30 days. "He won't," Zion said. "How do you know?" "Because contesting it means more data review," Zion said. "And the data is not his friend. He's smart enough to know that." Kaz made a small sound that was not quite agreement and not quite acknowledgement, the Serrano version of HM. They stood in silence for another moment. Then Kaz said, "You should know. 3 of the families that voted against the reform have already contacted our office asking about the implementation timeline. They want to be early adopters." Zion said nothing. He just looked at the hallway and felt the particular, complicated satisfaction of a person who had built something that was already moving faster than they had expected it to. "Malikai wants to brief the implementation team tomorrow," Kaz continued. 8 a.m. He wants you to run it." "I'll be there," Zion said. Another silence. The cluster near Prescott had thinned to nothing now. His uncle was speaking to a young aide from one of the smaller Eastern families, the only person in the vicinity who hadn't found a reason to redirect, And even from across the hallway Zion could see the quality of Prescott's focus change, compress, become smaller. Less projection. More maintenance. The specific social adjustment of a person who was used to being the largest presence in a room and was realizing, for the first time in a very long time, that he wasn't. Then something happened that Zion did not expect, and had not prepared for, and was therefore not entirely composed when it occurred. From the council members section of the reception. Not loudly, not with any intention of being overheard beyond the immediate vicinity. Malachi Serrano was speaking to a group of 3 allied family representatives. Zion caught the tail end of the sentence without meaning to, because the hallway had gone quieter and his name carried. Malachi said, "Our Omega has already drafted the implementation framework. We expect the first phase rollout to begin within 30 days. Our Omega," not said possessively, not the way families said it when they meant property or liability or social obligation. Said the way someone said our architect or our strategist or our colleague. Said as a simple designation of belonging that carried, underneath it, nothing that diminished and everything that included. Zion stood at the edge of the hallway and felt something move through his chest that he didn't immediately have a name for. It was not the same thing as relief. It was deeper than relief. It was the feeling of a word being used correctly in public by people with the power to define what it meant, and having it mean something that had never been allowed to mean that before. One of the allied representatives that Malachi was speaking to glanced across the hallway and found Zion and gave him the particular nod of professional acknowledgement. The one that said, "I see you, and I understand now what the geography of the situation is, and I will factor that in going forward." Zion nodded back. He was asked, formally, the following afternoon, to choose his official affiliation. The council bylaws had been updated. The new framework required it. Every Omega working in an advisory capacity within a syndicate network was to have a formal affiliation on record, not for the old reasons, not as a succession instrument or a social positioning tool, but as a professional designation with corresponding responsibilities and protections. He had 24 hours to submit his choice. He already knew what it was, but he took the full 24 hours anyway, not because he was uncertain, because some decisions deserved to be held for a moment before they became official, because he had waited long enough for things to be named correctly that he wanted to feel the weight of being the one who named this one. The Serrano Group's 14th floor was quiet at 7 in the morning. The main offices didn't fill up until 8:30, 8:45 on the days when Dre had back-to-back calls and the energy of the floor followed his mood the way it had a tendency to. But at 7, it was just the light coming through the Hudson-facing windows and the particular quality of a workspace that had been built for thinking rather than performing, and Zion Beaumont sat in the chair he had come to think of as his. Not assigned, not formally designated, just the one he always used, by the window with the city spread out below him, and held the affiliation form in his hands. It was a single page, clean formatting, the kind of document that carried enormous consequence in the exact proportion to how understated it looked. There was a field for his name, a field for his Omega designation number, a field for his proposed affiliation, and at the bottom a signature line. He had been sitting with it for 20 minutes when Kaz walked in. Kaz didn't knock. None of them knocked, which Zion had initially found jarring and had now come to understand as the Serrano version of trust. You didn't perform access rituals with people you genuinely considered part of your space. Kaz walked in, saw the form on the desk, and sat down in the chair across from Zion without being asked. He looked at the form. Then he looked at Zion. "You've had 22 hours, Kaz said. "I have 2 more, Zion said. "We're not here to rush you." A pause. "But I wanted to say something before you signed it. While it's still a choice and not a record." Zion set the form down. He looked at Kaz with the attention he gave to things that mattered. "You don't owe us this," Kaz said. It came out flat and direct, the way everything the Serranos said came out. Not softened, not performed, just true. You built the reform framework. You stood in that chamber and made the argument. Whatever you did for us in the logistics work, we've gained more from you than we've given. If you want to file as an independent affiliate or affiliate with a different syndicate or go back to the Beaumonts." He stopped, made a small expression that was not quite a grimace and not quite nothing. The last one I think you already know my opinion on. But the point is, this document is not a debt payment. You have options. Zion looked at him for a long moment. I know I have options, he said. That's the first thing you gave me that my family never did. Kaz said nothing. He waited. What happened yesterday, Zion said, with Malikai? What he said to the Allied representatives about the implementation framework. He shouldn't have said that without asking you first, Kaz said immediately, with the specific, clipped quality of a man who had already had this conversation internally and had opinions about it. Dre told him the same thing. We don't speak for you without your consent. That's not who we want to be in this. Something warm and unexpected moved through Zion's chest. Not because the mistake had been acknowledged, people acknowledged mistakes, but because the correction had been instantaneous and principled and clearly already processed before he'd brought it up, which meant it had mattered to them independently of whether he knew about it. It's all right, Zion said. He wasn't wrong about the timeline, and he wasn't wrong about the designation. He paused. I just wanted to be the one who said it first, officially. Kaz nodded once. The particular nod of a man who understood exactly what that meant and why it mattered. The Beaumont family called at 9:15. Not Prescott. Not his father. His cousin Darren, which meant the family had sent the one member who had never personally wronged Zion, and was therefore the only one capable of making the call sound like an olive branch rather than a strategy. Darren's voice carried the specific texture of a person delivering a message they had been given rather than a message they had chosen. The family wants you to know that what happened at the council was, Prescott overstepped. Everyone knows that. There's been internal discussion. A lot of it. And the family wants to extend a formal apology and open a conversation about your return to a Beaumont-affiliated position. With different terms. Better protections. A real seat at the table. Zion listened to the whole thing. He let Darren finish. He did not interrupt. When Darren was done, Zion said, Tell them I appreciate the call. And then, because Darren deserved more honesty than the message he'd been sent to deliver, he said, And tell them I'm well. I genuinely am. That's not a posture. I'm well. A brief silence on the line. Then Darren said, in a voice that had nothing to do with the family message and everything to do with the cousin Zion had grown up across the dinner table from, I know. I can tell. I'm glad. That was the closest anyone in the Beaumont family would come to sincerity that day. Zion accepted it for what it was, not enough but real, and he let it be that. The affiliation meeting was at noon. Kaz, Dre, and Malikai were all there, which wasn't procedurally required but which the Serranos had apparently decided was personally necessary. They sat on one side of the conference table. Zion sat on the other, which was also not procedurally required. There was a single chair at the head of the table designated for the filing party, but which had the specific quality of a conversation that all four of them had decided, without discussing it, that they wanted to have face-to-face before it became paperwork. Before I file this, Zion said, and he had the form in front of him on the table, I want to say something to all three of you. Dre looked up from the table. Malikai set down his coffee. Kaz did nothing because Kaz never needed to rearrange himself to pay attention. He was already there. I came into this building 6 weeks ago prepared to be used, Zion said. That is not a criticism of you. It's an honest description of my prior experience of every professional situation I'd ever been in. I was prepared to be tolerated and managed, and pointed at problems the way my family used to point me at social situations. Useful at a distance, dismissed up close. That was the framework I walked in here with. He paused. I was wrong, and I don't know exactly what to do with that yet. But I know that being wrong in this direction is the best thing that's happened to me professionally, and I wanted to say that out loud before I made it official. The room was quiet, not uncomfortably. The Serranos were, among their many specific qualities, profoundly comfortable with silence. They let it sit. Then Malikai said something that Zion had not expected, and that rearranged something in the back of his understanding of the last 6 weeks. We chose you, Malikai said. At the gala, we chose you in the first 30 seconds of that logistics conversation, before you'd finished the first sentence. And I want you to know why, because I think you've been operating under the assumption that you earned it by performing well enough. That's not what happened. Zion looked at him. We chose you, Malachi said, because you think long-term. You answered a question about a current logistics problem by diagnosing the upstream cause and projecting the downstream consequence, in under a minute, in a social situation where no one was asking you to and there was nothing to gain from it. That's not performance. That's how your mind works. And he stopped, made a brief, honest gesture with one hand. We don't think that way. We're good at what we do. We are very good at what we do. But the structural, long arc thinking, the kind of thinking that built that reform document, that is not where we're strongest. We needed it. We recognized it in you immediately. And we're aware that what looks from the outside like us doing you a favor is actually not what it is at all. Zion sat with that for a moment. It was the most words Malachi had ever said to him in a single run, which suggested it had been waiting to be said for a while. Thank you for telling me that, Zion said finally. It's accurate, Malachi said. It didn't need thanks. It needed saying. Kaz, from across the table, are you ready? Zion looked down at the form. He picked up the pen. In the field marked Proposed Affiliation, he wrote in clear, unhurried letters, Serrano Group, Advisory Council, Independent Standing. He signed his name. He set the pen down. It was not, he realized in that moment, protection. It had never been protection. Not from the beginning. Not from the moment Kaz had asked him a logistics question in a ballroom and waited without performing for an honest answer. Protection was what his family had offered and then withdrawn depending on what he was worth to them. This was something different. This was integration. Being built into something rather than attached to it. Being part of the structure rather than an ornament on the outside of it. He understood, sitting in that conference room with his signature drying on the form and the Hudson silver and flat outside the window, that this was what belonging looked like when it didn't come with conditions. And that he had, for the first time in his adult life, found a room where the version of him that was allowed to exist was the same as the version of him that actually did. That was not a small thing. He let it be the large thing it was. 6 months is not a long time. In the logistics world, 6 months is the gap between a quarterly projection and its reconciliation. In the syndicate world, 6 months is barely enough time for a new alliance to stop being described as new. In Zion Beaumont's life, 6 months turned out to be enough time to rebuild the structural foundation of the Eastern Seaboard's Allied Succession Framework, expand the Serrano Group's Atlantic shipping volume by 11%, get quoted in 3 industry publications by a writer who described him as the consultant rewriting the rules of syndicate power, and finally, stop flinching every time someone walked into a room without knocking. He narrated his own life now, sometimes in the quiet moments, not out loud, just in the back of his head, the way people did when something had changed so significantly that their internal voice was still catching up with the external reality. He would be sitting at his desk or walking through the 14th floor, or reviewing a brief in the conference room that had become as familiar to him as his own apartment, and he would think, this is what it looks like now. This is the current configuration. Pay attention because this is real. The Reform Succession Charter had been adopted by 14 of the 19 Allied families within the first 4 months. 2 more were in active implementation. The remaining 3 were, by the Council's official record, under review, which in syndicate language meant they were waiting to see if the first 14 collapsed before they committed. They wouldn't collapse. The data on diversified leadership was already bearing out in the early performance metrics, not dramatically, not in ways that made headlines, but in the steady, compounding way that structural improvements always showed up, in retention numbers, in contract renewal rates, in the gradual, measurable reduction of succession-related disruptions across the network. Zion tracked it the way he tracked everything, with attention and without attachment to having been right. Being right was not the point. The point was that the system worked better now, and the people inside it had more options than they'd had 6 months ago, and that was a fact that existed independently of whether anyone gave him credit for it. Some people did give him credit. More people than he'd expected, and in more direct ways than the syndicate world typically operated. Rashida Harmon had become a formal advisory client. Their working relationship was, by any professional measure, one of the more productive things Zion had been involved in. She was sharp, direct, and had absolutely no interest in managing him, which remained one of the most consistently refreshing experiences of his professional life. She had said, in their second meeting, "I don't need you to perform confidence for me. I need you to tell me what you actually see." And he had, and it had been fine, and that had been the beginning of a working relationship that functioned because both parties were interested in the outcome rather than the performance of it. Dre had taken to consulting Zion on risk exposure frameworks on a biweekly basis, which had started as a formal meeting and had gradually, over 6 months, become something closer to a standing conversation, the kind that picked up where it left off regardless of how much time had passed in between. Dre was a methodical thinker who worked in tight, precise circles around a problem, and Zion's tendency to project several steps downstream was, in their working dynamic, genuinely useful rather than disruptive. They had, without discussing it, developed a shorthand. Zion had never had a professional shorthand with anyone before. It turned out shorthand was just what happened when you trusted someone's mind enough to skip the explanatory scaffolding. Malachi ran the implementation team meetings with the focused, economical energy he brought to everything. He was the one who had said, in front of the Allied representatives, "Our Omega," and he had said it again since then on several occasions in various professional contexts, each time with the same flat matter-of-factness that contained, underneath it, the specific quality of a person who had decided how a thing should be named and was not going to be inconsistent about it. Zion had stopped feeling the shock of it after the third time. Now it landed the way accurate things landed, not with surprise, just with recognition. Kaz remained, of the three of them, the hardest to read and the one Zion had come to trust most completely. Not because Kaz was warmer, he wasn't, but because he was exact. When Kaz said something, it was what he meant. When Kaz didn't say something, it was because he hadn't decided yet and he wasn't going to perform a decision he hadn't made. In a world that Zion had spent his entire life navigating by reading the gap between what people said and what they meant, being around someone for whom that gap was essentially non-existent he didn't have the right word for it yet. Restful. That was close. It was restful. Prescott Beaumont had not contested the council vote. Zion had predicted he wouldn't, and he had been right, and the fact of being right about it carried no satisfaction. His uncle had retreated from the council's social network with the specific, quiet efficiency of a man who understood when a position had become untenable and was cutting his losses before anyone could document the full extent of them. He had resigned from 2 committee roles. He had not attended the last 3 Allied social events. The Beaumont family had, in the months since the vote, begun the slow, graceless process of repositioning themselves relative to the new syndicate landscape. Not with humility, because the Beaumont family was constitutionally incapable of humility, but with the pragmatic adaptation of people who had run the numbers and understood that the new numbers did not favor the old posture. Zion's father had called once, in month 2. He had not apologized. Gideon Beaumont was also not constitutionally capable of apology. But he had said, after a silence that lasted long enough to be intentional, "You built something serious." It was said in a tone that Zion had never heard from his father before. Not pride exactly. Gideon Beaumont didn't produce pride easily or often. But something adjacent to it. Something in the register of a man who had made a calculation about his son and had discovered that the calculation had been wrong, and was, in his own limited way, registering that. Zion had said, "I know," and then, "Thank you for calling." Not with warmth that he didn't have, and not with coldness that would have been dishonest. With the specific, honest neutrality of a person who was at peace with a relationship for exactly what it was and exactly what it wasn't and had stopped needing it to be something else. His father had hung up. Zion had sat with the call for a few minutes, then gone back to work. That felt right. That felt, he thought, like health. The industry profile piece ran in month 5. The writer had described him as the consultant rewriting the rules of syndicate power, which was accurate enough not to be annoying and inaccurate enough in its framing that Zion had found it mildly amusing. He had not rewritten the rules. He had applied existing data to existing rules and demonstrated that the rules were producing demonstrably poor outcomes. The rewrite had been done collectively by a council of 41 people who had chosen to vote with the evidence. He had just built the evidence. That was a meaningful distinction, and it was one that he suspected the industry profile writer would not have found interesting, so he had not raised it during the interview. He had, however, raised it with Kaz afterward, because Kaz was the one person in his current life who would find it genuinely interesting rather than pedantically precise. Kaz had said, "You're going to spend the rest of your career correcting the framing of how people describe what you did." And Zion had said, "Probably." And Kaz had said, "Good. It means you're doing things worth framing incorrectly." That was either wisdom or a very compressed way of being annoying. With Kaz, the line was thin. 6 months in, the implementation framework was running. The charter amendments were taking hold. The Serrano Group's logistics performance had hit metrics they hadn't projected until Q2 of the following year. Zion had his own office on the 14th floor now. Not assigned, negotiated, which had taken 40 minutes and the involvement of all 3 triplets and a genuinely alarming amount of precision about window placement. But it was his. The chair by the window was his. The rhythm of the floor, the shorthand with Dre, the biweekly strategy sessions with Kaz, the implementation reviews with Malachi, all of it was his. Not borrowed. Not provisional. Not dependent on performing something he wasn't. One Tuesday morning, 6 months and 3 days after Zion Beaumont had walked into the Caldwell Grand between his uncle and his cousin to be positioned as a social asset for his family's declining influence. One Tuesday morning, Malachi Serrano dropped a new logistics brief on Zion's desk, said Veracruz is doing it again, and walked out. He meant the fuel surcharge structure had shifted ahead of schedule, and someone needed to remodel the exposure. Zion pulled up the data, ran the preliminary model in his head in about 45 seconds, and started drafting the analysis. Across the hall, he could hear Dre on a call. Down at the end of the corridor, Kaz's voice. Low and flat and deliberate, the way it always was, carrying through a closed door. The particular ambient sound of a floor built around work that mattered. They still called him biologically useless sometimes. Not often and not cruelly. It had become, over 6 months, the specific kind of shorthand that only existed between people who were close enough to know the full context of a joke and trust each other with it. Dre had said it once, in the middle of a particularly brutal implementation review, when Zion had solved a succession protocol conflict in a way that none of them had considered, and Dre had looked at him and said, "You are genuinely biologically useless and structurally indispensable, and I don't know how to reconcile that, so I've decided to stop trying." It had been, in its way, the most affectionate thing anyone in that office had ever said to him. It was hard to insult someone who had redesigned the system you profit from. That was just physics. Zion finished the preliminary Veracruz model and sent it to Malachi with a note that said, 8% exposure if the surcharge schedule holds. Recommend we move the Q3 volume back to Gulf by week 3. Same solution as last time for the same reason. He attached the full analysis for the record because the record mattered and thoroughness was, in his opinion, a form of respect. He leaned back in his chair. Outside the Hudson-facing window, the city was doing what the city did, operating at full capacity, indifferent to individual outcomes, grinding forward with the specific, relentless productivity of a system too large to notice any single person inside it. Zion noticed. He had always noticed. That was the part that had never been the problem. He had spent 26 years being told, in 100 different registers and by 100 different people, that the way his mind worked was an inconvenience in service of the thing that was actually wrong with him. He had spent 26 years in rooms that treated his analysis as a curiosity and his personhood as a liability and his future as a negotiating position for other people's ambitions. Turns out he was never defective. He had just been optimized for a different future. And it had taken finding the right room for that to become something other than a private, unverifiable theory. Now it was a fact. And the facts, as always, did not require his uncle's permission to be true. Did Zion make the right call saying nothing when the Serranos asked what to do about his uncle? Or should he have let them move? And which chapter hit hardest for you? Drop it in the comments. If this story found you at the right time, share it. Someone else needs it too.